welcome to the Big Brain Time Debate Podcast. Although today it might be more like a leisurely discussion. My name is Seth.
I'm Kyle.
I'm Caitlin.
I'm Ira.
And when we were trying to figure out sides before the show, we found out that there wasn't a lot of like, oh, let's goofily disagree with stuff. It was just actual discussion about story writing, which I was like, you know what, let's roll with this. So the question from Kyle's friend, our secret source for topics. He's our topics dealer.
Our topics dealer. Yes, that's his official title now.
Yes. Is in storytelling, can/should logic be thrown out the window in order to lead the audience to an emotional reaction?
Basically, before the show, I was saying yes and no, because there's good examples of both and terrible examples all over the place for completely unwarranted deaths in movies and TV shows, and I won't even go into those because I want this to say a lighthearted podcast. And I've only been here once before. Please, I don't get that reputation.
It's interesting because I mean you could like she said, you can go either way because I think there's a time and a place for both, like having logic and then not having logic.
I mean, it's easy to argue away logic when your universe has literal dragons and unicorns and magic and all that stuff. But at the same time, there needs to be concrete. There's still people with psychology and physiology behind it. So if your character is a human that has been sitting on the couch for their whole life, they can't suddenly vault over buildings and logically beat up 20 people in one sitting.
So one potentially helpful thing might be to separate logic and realism as concepts. Like a story can be extremely unrealistic and have a very strong internal logic to it. And I think sometimes maybe people will say that like fantasy stories and stuff are less logical. I kind of want to argue that on the whole, they might actually be more logical by necessity. Like if you think about the filmmaking style of Star Wars, it's intentionally shot from angles way far in the back to give you very objective feeling wide shots so that these fantastic things feel normal. Compare that to a David Lynch movie where he's largely presenting somewhat normal things in the most bizarre ways. Partially because they are mundane and familiar.
Okay. But it's also like there needs to be in like plot twists and like, you know, that one argument I've seen is talking about like, you know how there will be the hero versus the villain, and the villain will say something like, you and I are one and the same, and then try to argue that like the hero is no better than the villain. It only makes sense if the hero hasn't been portrayed as a purely good person up to that point. And a lot of writers will do that and work with like one little flaw, like the hero likes their friends just a little too much and will do anything to protect them, and the villain will just suddenly be like, that makes us the same because that means you would do anything that I would do for that. And no. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think so.
Whereas if you actually make your character a flawed character that logically the audience will root for, but also isn't the perfect human being, a villain could actually make that argument.
Okay, I'm wondering if the definition of logic and emotion here, I'm wondering about flipping it around a little bit. So
Okay.
when you're talking about, and also before the show, you were talking about like with stuff like Game of Thrones, where the characters will die seemingly out of nowhere at times. That maybe it has more to do, and you were talking about build up. I don't know if it's necessarily illogical for maybe a villain to try to pry at a hero with that, but it doesn't affect the audience. So maybe it's not about logic versus reason as much as short-term emotional storytelling versus long-term emotional storytelling.
Yeah, that makes a little bit more sense, because like what we were talking about beforehand was like character death. In the Game of Thrones instance, characters will seemingly die just suddenly, quickly, fast, because it's Game of Thrones and people die all the time. Whereas like in talking about The Mandalorian, I'm not going to say what happens. There was a particular instance where the buildup was perfect. Like, this is the first time I can honestly say that a character death was handled absolutely perfectly, got the perfect amount of emotional response, and made actual sense that this character would die, outside of the reasoning being we could shock so many viewers by killing off this character.
Maybe if, say, the story's internal rules get broken in a way that leads to a better story, including in a long-term sense. So
Yeah,
like
that's kind of the direction I was thinking of when like first hearing about the, the topic was that, it's, but should the internal rules of the story be broken in order to have like an audience emotional reaction?
Okay.
So
like,
like
something happens to produce that reaction, like,
Mhm.
but it breaks the rules of the world that the story
but
is.
it wouldn't, like, it doesn't, maybe not completely break it, but like bend it to a point where you're not sure if that's should be allowed.
Right.
Like, so, like, say maybe character resurrection. I mean, like, you can, I'm sure we all have opinions on character resurrections in general, but
Mhm.
Marvel.
yeah.
Well, have any of have you guys seen Dragon Ball in any way, shape, or form?
No.
So that's actually a perfect example of that, because originally, like with the Dragon Balls, you can bring back any amount of people, but you can only bring them back once. There was a major character death, and it was shocking and all that stuff. A bunch of main characters actually died, and they were all brought back, and everything was good. And then more people died, but the Dragon Balls were rendered inept. So they were like, maybe there are more Dragon Balls if we go to the home planet, the people that made them. And they do find those, and those Dragon Balls can only bring about one person at a time, but they can bring them back as many times as you want. And then the main character perma dies, but then he is brought back by some really bullcrap reasoning later on in the show. So it completely wrecks the idea of character death, because they'll find a way to bring him back.
Yeah.
So that's why it's like not done well.
That's like every Marvel comic book ever.
Kinda.
And what's kind of interesting is I'm thinking about it, and I think one of the best Batman stories might be Under the Red Hood, which is a story of weird character resurrection. And even though the Lazarus Pit exists, it's like, really? But at the same time, it challenges Batman in an extremely unique way. So the long-term emotional storytelling is good, but the logic and kind of internal consistency or state.
The short-term logic.
Well, I believe the Lazarus Pit was a thing well before Under the Red Hood. So it exists, but it's used in a new way. And you can argue it bends it, but it's done in a really good way, because it's not Ra's al Ghul. It's Robin. So it's a different person brought back under different circumstances with a different new motivation for being brought back.
Yeah.
So that makes sense.
Okay.
So that could be like something that was already kind of like, it's established, but it may have felt already kind of, illogical or nonsensical for like the story itself until it was used under that context. And, basically, or given new purpose under that context, and thus, becomes a much better thing, I guess. That's a very technical term right there, but.
Well, even going back to like what I was talking about with Knights of the Old Republic 2, where it completely breaks the concept of dark side bad, light side good. You are suddenly able to use all these different force powers that you weren't able to in the first game if you were without being on the dark side. But it's completely logical why the light side doesn't mean you're a good person and the dark side doesn't mean you're a bad person, because of the way it's presented. Because the force isn't good or evil itself, it's just the Force. And it finally took someone in the game just being like, it's just the Force. Jedi aren't actually good people.
So, maybe what this is leading us to is that rarely, maybe with story, logic, so to speak, that nothing within a fictional world can be truly illogical, but they can seem plausible to the audience. That it's about presentation, not about an actual consistency, I suppose. Not an actual consistency.
Well, there should be some level of consistency, unless if a change to the rule is presented, so long as it's done right, and the item or thing in question is still inherently what it was before at its basic level, then there doesn't have to be like staunch consistency, but it can't suddenly be a brand new different thing.
As long as it's presented in a good way, as long as the person who's doing it chooses to present it in a way that makes sense, whether it be logical or illogical.
Mm-hmm.
I think it just depends on who the author or filmmaker or writer or whoever it is. They just have to do it in a way that either makes or doesn't make sense enough that it works.
I think that's a really strong caveat about not changing the underlying what something is. I think that might be a really strong argument there. So I'm thinking it gets difficult because these become such abstractions, which is always the
True.
difficulty with something as broad as writing. So I'm trying to think of how can logic truly be broken in a fictional story? Because my theory is that a lot of it has to do less with what is actually there as much as expectations. So there are some times where people, say, going back through a TV show, might have certain episodes that they think completely broke the logic because they were watching them all the way through. Because they were watching them when they were being released on a weekly basis. But compare that to somebody binge watching on Netflix, and it might seem like this is just a part of the whole.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to use another example. There was a show called Ghost Stories that was released in Japan, and a little bit Seth knows what I'm talking about. Ira knows what I'm talking about too. Kyle, I'll explain it to you. So basically,
please, I don't know. Caveat: the only thing I know about Japan, like fiction in Japan, is there are anime and then Godzilla. That's all I got.
It's an anime.
Okay.
And basically what happened is it didn't have a good receiving in Japan. So when it was given to American voice actors, they just said, do whatever you want with it. And so it was essentially turned into what are those things called on YouTube?
A bridge series.
A bridge series. It was basically just a paid for a bridge series with actual voice actors and everything.
Gotcha.
Something that they make fun of in the show is that they ran out of funding. They had to cut it off at season 1. So one of a particular character dynamic suddenly flipped. One of the characters is like a really hated character by the rest of the main cast, and then suddenly they're all friends, and he like sacrifices himself to save them.
Gotcha.
They literally talk about it in the show where he's like, I'm gonna do this totally out of character snuggle with my person who is suddenly my friend, even though I've hated you for this, like on and on and on. It's hysterical. But it's a lot of times shows will actually do that where it'll do it completely because they're people, we expect them to act like people. So when people that hate each other suddenly like each other, there is no rhyme or reason to it. And it shuts off any kind of actual attention to that relationship. Like if there's a natural character progression where the characters grow to like each other, that makes sense because there has to be a lot of work put into a relationship. But if it's a sudden transition, everyone's like, hey, that's not right. Why don't they hate each other anymore? We have to have an example. We have to have a reason.
So that kind of is like an example of, logic that that's that's not really attached or dependent on like the setting, but just our personal expectations of how people normally act. Like, this is kind of universal logic that isn't that can't be made normal to break under any circumstance, no matter like the situation. Because even when writing like different species and stuff, you can't not make that kind of thing alien, basically. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, that like the basic principles and consistencies and expectations of human emotion will still need to carry over.
Basically, yeah.
Right.
Also, I do want to make a caveat real quick. Just because we mentioned something does not mean the Big Brain Time debate podcast officially endorses it, including Ghost Stories.
We don't do any of that.
We're
It's a masterpiece.
PG. We're not.
It is a masterpiece. That is my personal opinion. I will help your podcast by saying it is a personal masterpiece.
All right.
I do not endorse the ideals held by Ghost Stories. But
I think it's really it's almost up to personal preference.
yeah, honestly, because it depends on. Yeah, it would kind of depend on whether you want something more. Why you go to see movies, why you read books, and the kind of person are you more right-brained or left-brained?
Yeah.
Personally, I see it as. Go ahead, Seth.
I was going to say the best example I think I've ever seen of a show that is nearly illogical in its insanity and yet completely works is JoJo's Bizarre Adventure.
I still need to see that.
Never seen it, just heard the music.
It kind of has internal story rules, but they're so absurd that you get to this point where you just have to realize it's like a D&D game. Somebody can just say, I am rolling to remove somebody's pinky toe without them noticing. And like...
As a DM, I can confirm stuff like that. I had someone rolling at 20 while trying to pants a wizard.
Yeah, so like these things where you're like, we didn't see this character do that, but you just get used to it, so the expectations are there. Or, I guess fewer expectations are there for how logical fights are going to be, and then your personal preference, if you're okay with that, ends up dictating it. So what are you going to say, Ira?
Okay, well, I was going to say, at least for me anyway, it depends on the execution of, what they're trying to do. If it does break eternal logic, but like the purpose for breaking eternal logic ends up, just being good for the story overall in the long run. Like, say maybe the way they resurrected a character doesn't really make much sense, but, if that character resurrection ends up being a, very good thing for the overall progression of the plot and story, then, we can kind of just overlook it, basically.
Well, I think it could also depend on how the writers frame other characters' reactions to, if they have the other characters react to the rules breaking. So, like, if a character questions, like, how on earth were you able to be revived? And then it goes into a detailed explanation, or it takes a long time to get that detailed explanation, that helps, because then the viewers know that, like, it's a little bit more complex and the characters are a little bit as confused. At the same time, if it's also phrased in a context of, like, the characters completely know what's happening, and they don't have to lore dump it because everyone knows what's happening, that can confuse the audience a little bit. But at the same time, you'll get a lot of people being like, oh, okay, it's fine. They understand it, so I guess I'll try to understand it too.
All right. I don't know if anybody has any closing thoughts.
Good discussion.
This was fun. I finally got to put my degree to use. On a Zoom call for something I'm not getting paid for now.
That's more or less what our last guest said. You think the
do we have to start
seminary
paying our
for
guest
giving
stars
the
now?
academic rigor.
No, I can.
Of course, if we start paying our guest stars, then I demand a wager, but,
I will accept a Twix bar.
Aha, okay. I will ship you a Twix bar across the border.
Like Twixes across the border.
It's a giant box.
Get the shipments.
Uh,
They all hear. All right. See you next week, dear audience.
Woohoo!
Bye.